Alright, what are we doing today? Well, I'm going to make a line editor, or start a line-oriented text editor, as opposed to the usual editors of today, VS Code or Eclipse or JetBrains or Sublime or what have you. I'm going to call these character-oriented or character-based editors where you have a cursor you can move around with the mouse or the keyboard, sort of in between or at any given letter on the screen, and the text that you can see all on the screen, and you can scroll and all, and that's all well and good. A line editor is from the old halcyon days of yore with the teleprinters or teletypewriters where you clickety clacking and you ticka 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 and you ding, and you move the, well, you might not move the platen, but you could, you'd be typing your stuff, it'd be printing out on the paper, you'd have a thing that you, little knob that you roll the paper. Anyway, connected up to electricity and later the internet or a network would be a teletypewriter or a teleprinter. And it's the same basic concept, but editors made for these machines, because you had to edit text or do word processing or things, will understandably they worked a bit different if you didn't read or write data off a serial line or paper tape or anything. If you had an interactive terminal or an interactive keyboard that you're running these editor programs on, they ran on lines at a time because it made more sense because you didn't have the CRT screen or anything. I'm going to make a sort of ed clone, or ed, but I'm going to call it ed. And that sort of goes back to the lineage of the editors that I'm using today. I'm using Vim usually these days, or Vim keybinds in my other editors, and that comes from VI. It's Vim, it's VI improved is what Vim stands for, and VI is the visual mode of EX, which is extended, the extended mode of an earlier, enhanced mode of an earlier editor called EM, or Ed for Mortals, which was an enhanced form of plain old Ed, which was brought about by Ken Thompson from his ideas of working with QED and other editors beforehand. So I'm going to make an ed clone because I don't have original ideas and it's already made, so I can go off a given specification based on man pages or help docs or other things. So I'll do that. Ed usually had commands that you give it a range of lines to work on, so you give it like 1, 2 for lines 1 through 2, and you give a command to run on those lines. So let's say 1, 3C would be changing the first 3 lines in whatever document or buffer of text that you're editing. So our commands will be based off that. We won't be moving a cursor around or anything. So it's a little easier to understand and, well, maybe not understand, but it's a little easier to program, at least for a bit here. We can divvy it up and make functions per command, for example, and have things be fairly modular. So the first version of ed is why I have this page up, was just because it still had the text. Ed is the standard text editor. It's young whippersnappers today don't pay deference to good old Ed. As well as the original Ed didn't have very many commands, and it had a fixed size buffer. We don't have very much stuff to start with if we want to have something fairly close to that. It didn't have that many commands. It didn't even have a command to print text with line numbers. So Ken Thompson was not working with line numbers when he made this, which is more than I'll be able to do. I'll add that as probably one of the first commands. But that's interesting. But if we get to the point where we implement all of these, or a good subset of these, we can move on from there to, say, the latest POSIX standard 2024 as of this recording. And we can go and expand from there. Or I'll probably just look at the OpenBSD man pages because they're really nice and succinct, and I have things that fit all on one screen. So as you can see, some of these commands here, these are just the defaults that they have laid out. For the line ranges, so let's say to substitute text or replace subtext within a line, this just says if you don't give any line ranges to this S command, it'll use the current line through the current line. So the current line is usually denoted by a period in ed, and the last line in the buffer by a $sign. And that makes it a lot easier to give line ranges. If I want to print every line in the file, and, well, usually they have a percent or just a plain comma for that now, but originally, if you wanted to print every line in a file, you'd do something like 1, $sign P, 1 through the last line. So we'll implement stuff like that as we go for address parsing. To make this a little bit harder on myself, I'm going to, let's say, start from quote-unquote nothing, or scratch. I'll just start from a cat command, and we'll make an editor, and then I'll use that first version of the editor to then edit subsequent versions of itself to add more functionality, a sort of bootstrapped editor project, as opposed to a bootstrap compiler or OS project or something more traditionally associated with bootstrapping. But I'll do a bootstrapped editor if you consider it that. I'll be cheating a little bit because I'm assuming I have a terminal emulator and a cat command at minimum. You can imagine I put this in through a paper tape to an imaginary machine or flip front panel switches on a PDP or something, and that's fine. To be a little bit anachronistic, I think I want to try out C23 for the standard for this. I'll program in C, of course, because that's what I do on this channel, apparently. So I'll do that. It was either C23 or C89. I didn't know which one I wanted to do, but I really like designated initializers, and I really like compound literals, and I like having bool and true and false already defined and stuff like that, because I'm lazy, so I'll probably go with C23. So, alright, I'm going to call this line editor or lined, because Microsoft still probably owns Edlin or Edline, so I don't want to mess with their anagram name. So I'll go with lined for my anagram name and shorten it for line editor. So we'll do that. I'll make a good old makefile right here. You can do it by default with the cat command, and I have tabs for indentation, so we'll go with that. I will define POSIX for this just because the latest version of POSIX in make, which my GNU make should support, has these double colon equal things, which just says whatever you evaluate into this macro, do it once immediately. It's sort of like a constant or an immediate evaluation. It's not a deferred evaluation like just the equal is. I'll use GCC and Clang because I want to try out their sanitizers later on. After I make sure I get a functioning editor and it's not too buggy, I'll try out the sanitizers. If not, the compiler RT packages I got on Linux here now to try out other things for sanitizing. GCC might only support a subset of the things that Clang does, so we'll see. I got everything installed, so we'll see how that goes later on, I think, if I want to mess with those. For flags, yeah, I'll do C23, enable all the warnings. For this, I'm going to do pedantic as well, although I like some GNU extensions. But anyway, I'll make a basic thing. We'll mess with that stuff later and other C2Y stuff as it comes up. C23 rather, not C2Y. But we'll have a basic thing here. So if I make a line.c file, make will pick that up automatically. If I make a default target, that just says, make lined as the output. And we'll have a cleanup for that. I'll do the RM sort of built-in thing, so it should translate to RMRF or whatever the Windows equivalent is, delete, I guess. I might make a copy command to save my source in case I corrupt it, and for that I'll need sort of an if-def in the makefile, but I'll mess with that later. We'll just do this right now. So Control-D or Control-C to end input for the concat command here. And that should exist already, and it does. Okay, so I'm using bash. And for bash, if I'm doing just a cat, it's fine. If I want to be able to do minimal editing of a concat command, I can use a heredoc and go back to the previous sort of full input line that I put in. If I do this, for example. But usually within that, I have not tabs, but autocomplete. But I turned that off because I have bash as my shell, and I turned on autocomplete disabling through disable completion. So I did this, bind set disable completion on, and that turns off autocomplete on my tab key, although your setup may be different. But that's so I can use tabs for indentation and not have to press space a million times. But if I turn that off, see I have autocomplete. So I'm going to turn that on, keep it on so I can use a tab key. And that's only really affecting within heredocs for this video. But anyway, we'll make a basic thing here. So let's say I'll make a basic test to test out that this actually works and my C environment is set up. For C23, you don't have to put void if you don't have any arguments. Putting an empty arg list or empty parameter list counts the same as void now, at least for declarations, I think. So that's something new. We'll have basic hello world there. We'll end it, except I meant to end it with EOF. There we go. And that's there. So I can make it, I can run that. We didn't have any issues. All right. So I will do, can actually edit here docs basically, but I'll just type that again. So let me make a minimum viable editor for the starting video. By that I mean minimum viable editor MVE, trademark patent pending. No, I mean the minimal set of operations that can be used to edit text, including itself if I want to bootstrap it from itself, so to speak. The minimum operations to edit text I'm going to consider are adding lines to our buffer, deleting lines from the buffer, printing the lines to know what we're doing, and writing the lines out to actually affect and write changes. And if you want, you can do quit, or you can have the OS clean up your memory and just do Control-C and then add in memory harvesting later. I might do that to be lazy, but we'll see. But basically those 5 operations would be my minimum viable editor that I can then use to edit files in general, or edit itself and add further functionality. So I'll go with those. So okay, we'll have, again, standard input output to be able to write to files and such. I'll have string for other operations like memcopy or string copy and things. I'll have standard live because I'll probably mess with memory along the way. I might have standard int for sized types if I need it. I can always add that in later if I want. Those might be the minimum here. There are other headers I could add. I could also define POSIX to use POSIX functions. The only ones I might use are for calling out to the shell, for reading or writing to a shell process for popen, pclose. Those are POSIX. But I think those are still included in, say, minimum GNU for Windows and other environs on other systems. So that may be alright, but I want this to be sort of low dependency on things that aren't just standard C headers. Calling out to the shell usually isn't part of that, though. So if I don't have POSIX, I do like using string dupe for some things, so I'm probably going to make my own string dupe function, just to not affect the POSIX sort of naming and namespacing if you have it defined. So I'm going to do that and add to a line buffer to get memory going. So okay, ed originally, or usually works on one, let's say global buffer of lines, or you could pass it through with a reference to every single function, but I'll probably just use global vars to be lazy, at least for a while. So I'll have a basic line buffer array in memory. This was a fixed size buffer originally in ed, but I can one-up it and make a larger fixed size buffer, so let's do that. And I'm going to have just a regular buffer that I read input into from standard in or from a file or wherever, and I'll have it be buff size sized, which this is defined in standard IO. On my OS, this is defined, or my libc, this is defined as 1024, so 1 kilobyte buffer. For ed commands, specifically, if I'm going to copy ed, it has commands in the form of this. Usually you have 1 or 2 line addresses to define a range of lines to operate on, separated by a comma or a semicolon. You'll have a command to run on those lines, and then parameters to that command. Like the move command here needs a position to move those lines to, or if you just have a file command, you can give it a new file name, for example. So we'll need things for that. So let's say I'll have addresses to be succinct with it. I'll say A1, 2, and 3. Ed also has a dollar and a dot or a period to signify the last line in the buffer or the current line for addresses. So I'm going to have things for those as well. The last and current line. And I'll need stuff for the command to run. And let's say I have something for the file name, the current file name we're running on, and let's say command parameters. So I'll say command parms. And I won't need other stuff for a while. That might be it. So we'll go with that. And yeah, mentioning POSIX, I'm going to have a string dupe here. So I'm trying to think ahead because I have to define this in one go with the heredoc, or else I have to edit this with a different editor and defeat the challenge. But let's say we have something to duplicate a string. That's all I should need for this starting video at most. So let's do that. And let's say we have a new or a temp thing here. I'll just call it new. That might make more sense. And we'll allocate for the length of the string +1 to include the null byte. So we want new memory. If we couldn't get that, then we'll return null, else I'm going to copy into that memory the string that we passed in, and we'll return that as a new pointer. So we have a string that we're copying with malloc. That means we'll have to free it later, of course. But that's all right. So we'll give the basic thing here for C. And alright, I'm going to say for the starting version of the editor, you have to actually pass in a file by default, and we'll make that optional later and add in command line flags and stuff later on. So let's say if argc is less than 2, or we don't have an argv1. What am I doing? Yeah, argc is less than 2 or argv we don't have for the file that's passed in as a first argument, then that would be bad. I'm going to say we're going to exit failure. Exit should be defined in standard live, I think. If not, it'll have a compile error. Okay, else we have a file, so let's read in our input file to the line buffer. So we'll have a thing for that. And I'm going to assume that's going to be an argv1. We have a file name here I could set that to as well. Maybe I'll do that. So file name will be argv1. And we'll have that here. So I'll fopen our file name for reading. I want to read this file. If we couldn't do that right now, I'm going to exit with failure again because I want to be able to read it. Otherwise, let's read it to lines. I'm going to use fgets for that, which is a simple thing that says I have a buffer, I have the size of the buffer, the size of data to read into this array, this buffer here for a line of input, and I'm taking that from some file stream. So from our file that we're opening, when it reaches end of file or it has an error, it'll return a null. Otherwise, it'll read into here. This does implicitly return the line pointer as well. But if it returns a null by reaching end of file, then there's no more lines, and this would be false. So while we're still getting a line, we still have a line pointer that we read in to this buffer. So I'm going to add that to the array, so that'll be lines. I'm going to add starting at line 1. I'm going to increment the last line to keep track of how much stuff we added to the buffer. So starting at line 1, lines will be 1 based, so you can effectively do, 1 to the last line, print everything out, stuff like that. Usually these are 1 based indexing for text editors. And I'll add in the line that was just read in, but I want to duplicate it because if I use the same buffer, we'll have issues really, really fast. You don't want to reuse memory and override it or have nulls or things. So we'll duplicate that with our string dup, which means we'll have to free it later. But this is an array. It's not really a linked list, but we do have a bunch of fragmented memory, which is not the best. You may want to look into data structures such as a gap buffer or a piece table or other things that are more efficient than just an array of lines, but we're going simple and old school with this, so that's okay. When we're done reading in all the lines from the file, we're going to close it. One aspect of fgets is that if there's a new line in the buffer, it ends and includes the new line inside of this. So if we enter in 1, 2, 3 and then the enter key, this line buffer would contain 1, 2, 3, a new line character, and then a null. So just keep that in mind for later. But that'll read everything in. Then I'm going to have an input loop to read next command to run on lines. C23 has booleans and true and false defined as keywords, and they're in the language, so we don't have to include standard bool or do a typedef enum or anything. Okay, so let's print a visual prompt by default as well, because, yeah, ed uses an asterisk by default usually. So we do ed new file.txt, new file doesn't exist, but we enable a prompt. We can say, okay, I can see where I'm entering in a new command into the editor. So say I edit to add lines at the start of the buffer. And line 2 here, and then I stop editing with a single period. We go back to the prompt. So we can see when we're entering in stuff for a command or we're running something in batch, let's say, versus entering in a command to run, which has a prompt. And usually that's just an asterisk to visualize things in a minimal way. And then if we print everything, we see everything there. I'm not going to save the file, so we'll end that. But that's just an example. So I'm going to print an asterisk by default, just to follow that lineage. I could do put char, but I'll just do printf because I just typed it out. Standard out on Linux here is line buffered by default, so I'm going to flush that as well. Use the comma operator. People don't use that enough, so I like some comma operator usage. And then we'll get the next command. So let's read in next line range and let's say line addresses and command to run. So let's do another get fgets, and let's say if we don't get a line to run from the user right now, we'll just end everything. So if we don't get a line of input from standard in here, then I'll just break and we'll say, done with the program. We'll end it there. Otherwise, we've got a line of input, and I want to parse out these addresses and the command to run. So I want better commands, or I want better functions to do that kind of stuff, but right now I'm trying to be really simple with this version 1, so I'm just going to do something like scanf, which is not great, but it'll work for our purposes. It's not regular scanf, but I'm scanning from this line of input. So let's say from that line, I expect the user to enter in a couple of integers. Yeah, a couple of integers separated by a comma, followed by a single character for a command to run. So these will be the lines, line 1 and 2, to give the range that we run a command on. and I'll read those into A1 and A2. I won't do A3 because that's for special things that only need a third command, like moving or copying a line range, but I'm not starting with that for version 1 here. We'll read in 2 addresses and a command to run on those lines, and if we try to read that in and it's less than 3 things, I'm going to say that's bad, don't do that. And we'll give a question mark because that's what Ed usually does, and then I'll give an actual response here as well. I guess Ed was probably written simply and just did put S or something. So this is the Ed School of Error Handling. Give no info, but just a question mark. No, I'll give an actual thing here afterwards, because this is how the errors actually work in Ed. If you choose to print things with an H or toggle verbose error printing with a capital H command, then it'll still print a question mark, but it'll give you the actual stuff after. So I'll try to emulate that a little bit here. And I'll just say input was invalid, or I'll say invalid input. So need line 1, I don't know, line 1, comma, line 2, command. That's reasonable. It's not great, but it's better error handling than just a question mark. Then let's say we validate input a little bit. I'll just write that. So the line ranges typically need to be in ascending order. So let's say if A1 is greater than A2, that would be bad. Else, we want to bound them by the amount of data that's in the array, or else it's filled with nulls. We'll get seg faults or worse. We'll have nasal demons like C people like to have. So let's say if we're given addresses, they're integers. So let's say if they enter in less than a negative number, so less than 0, that'd be bad. You can enter in 0 for some commands like appending to the start of the buffer. But let's say less than 0, you're not going to enter in a negative line. That doesn't exist. Or greater than the last line in the buffer, which is the $. That line doesn't exist either, so we'll just prevent some issues there. So if the first address or the second address is outside that range, that would be bad. And we'll print out addresses must be in ascending order and in range 0 to last line, which isn't going to make sense to the user. But there's not really a great way of doing that, but that's inclusive range. That at least explains a tiny bit. Okay, else we got addresses in a command, so I want to actually run the command, run command on lines. I want to make these separated functions, but unless I use the GNU or the GCC extension for nested functions, then I won't have that. So for this v1, I'll just switch on the command here. And I'll have the things for the minimum viable editor, MVE, copyright pending, experience. So let's say we add or append, really, lines to the buffer with an A command. And this will be while we get another line of text like we're doing here from standard in right now. Then we're going to keep adding lines to the buffer. How do we know when to stop? Traditionally, Ed stops with a single period on a line by itself, but we'll add that in right after this. So let's say while we get a line of input from standard in, we'll stop when we quit getting lines. If we got only a period and a new line there, then we know we're done. So that would also be break. So done inputting lines with single dot by itself. Otherwise, we got a new line to run. So let's move. Traditionally, append adds after. That's why it's called appending. You're adding after a certain point, and it adds after the first address. So I know I'm lazy right now to have a one-liner to keep it simple, but I have to enter in 2 addresses. For these commands, I'm only going to use the first address. So you still have to enter in like 1,1A to add after line 1. You just kind of need to ignore the second one here for now. That's annoying, but we'll fix that soon after this video. Well, appends after, say, given address, or address 1. So to be able to add a new line to the buffer, it's an array. Arrays have O of 1 operations for adding and deleting in the worst case. That shows up here because I can't just override a thing. I don't have a linked list or any other way of doing this with an array. So I have to move the lines to make room for a new one. So move, let's say, current buffer lines to make room for new line. I can do this with a one-liner. So let's say the address that I'm moving into, I'm going to say is going to be A1 plus 1. So the line above the line that I want to add. And into there, I'm going to add the current line and everything above that. So everything in the buffer, at and above the point at which I want to add a new line, I'm going to move up by one line to make one new line of room. So I have, this buffer, I want to add here, I move it up, so this line is free. That's what I'm doing here. Bad visual aid in the corner, but there you go. And the amount of data in bytes that would work for this operation would be the last line minus A1. It needs to be inclusive, so I'm going to add one. If we just did minus, it wouldn't work. So let's say we have a 10-line buffer. We want to add at line 3. I need to move lines 3 through 10 inclusive up. So that would be 8 lines, and 10 minus 3 would be 7. I have to add 1 to make that 8, to make that inclusive here. That's why I'm doing the plus 1. And we'll just, we can dereference lines to get the size of that type. That way if we change the type, then if we change the type and keep it an array or a pointer, this will still work. I won't have to change this line later. So we'll do that. We can add in our line here. So lines at A1, which was, pre-incremented. I can duplicate, I have to remember to do that, I can duplicate the line that was read in to add that new line, and I can add one to the last line, added new line to buffer. So we're good there. And I think that's all I have to do here, because we'll get another line. If we don't end, then we'll increment, we'll move everything up again, we'll add a new line, increment that. If we do get this, then we'll break and we'll be done, yeah. Okay, so not really efficient, but you're not doing this a whole bunch. It just means if you add at the start of a buffer and you have a 2 million line buffer, if memmove isn't very optimized, then that might take a while. But let's assume we're not going to reach hard limits, or you're not editing gigantic files just yet. Okay, so the counterpart to add would be delete. So we'll also have something to delete lines from the buffer. And for this, I'm going to free the memory first. Free line memory first to not have leaks. That would be bad. No memory leaks here. So this I am going to use both lines in the line range. So A1 to A2 inclusive. A1 to A2 less than or equal, we'll plus that, and I'll free it by just freeing lines offset by I. And then now that we've freed the memory, it's free for use, so we can use or compress the buffer lines by overriding the deleted lines. So if we delete at the start of a buffer, we want to be able to reuse that memory, so I'm going to move all the lines above that down to overwrite those. And then we'll have free space at the top of the buffer that we can then add back into from the A command, so to speak. We'll be moving everything up for that. So how do I do that? I'm going to, let's say, overwrite deleted lines. That have now been freed up. I can do this with another fancy one-liner memmove. So I'm going to move everything above the line range down. The line range that was just deleted. So into the first part of that range at address A1, I'm going to move everything above the line range that was deleted, which is A2 plus 1. So if I delete lines 1, 2, and 3, lines 4 and up will be moved down, because 1, 2, and 3 are free. And that means after this point, I can reference lines 1, 2, and 3, and they will be the original lines 4, 5, and 6, but they've been moved down to overwrite those. And for that, we don't need to be inclusive. We can just do minus the top end of the line range. I think, right? So if we delete lines 1, 2, and 3, say in a 10-line buffer, lines 4 through 10 would be moved down. After we've overwritten the lines, we have reduced effectively the lines by the lines that were deleted or freed up and overwritten. So I also have to reduce the last line by the range. So A2 minus A1, this one's inclusive. If we delete 3 lines, 1, 2, and 3, 3 minus 1 is 2, I have to add 1 to make that inclusive. Removed, say removed lines from buffer. But that's all I have to do there. So add deletes, let's go in alphabetic order. I'm going to add in an end command, which in ed is print with the line number, don't just print the text. I'm going to say print lines with line number. It'll print with a tab as well. For printing the lines, that's pretty simple. I can just do a one-liner for loop to do the line range inclusive and print it out to screen. So let's say A1 to A2 plus plus, I'll just print it out. With the line number would be traditionally a decimal here. an integer. So I'm going to print out I, and then a tab, and then the text. So since I'm reading everything in with fgetS, that will include a new line in the buffer that I read in. I don't have to do a /n here. I don't have to do put s, or else it'll double up the line endings with how I'm doing it right now. So that is all I need to do, I, and then lines offset by I to print the text. And then I'll also have a thing to print without the line number. Just plainly say without line number. And that will be the same thing. And I can be lazy here and do that. Again, without the new line, because the buffer will include a new line right now. So we will just do that. A1 to A2, just print lines out. Okay. Then we can have a quit command to be nice to the OS. That would probably be good. Quit the program. One reason I'm doing this as well, 2 commands, is because it's really easy to use the line numbers to know how to affect things. It's kind of hard to know where to add and delete lines from and to if you don't have the line numbers printed out, or to know where they are, or you have ESP, or you can see the code like Neo or something. But also with P, I can print things out without any formatting, and then it'll keep the indentation and everything, and I can be lazy and use a mouse copy paste in my terminal emulator. So until I make the M or T or move and copy commands, I'm going to be, 1, scrolling with the mouse, so hopefully you don't consider that cheating. And 2, I'm going to be using a little bit of mouse copy paste by highlighting and middle mouse clicking. So I'm considering those to be not cheating, even though they're assuming a terminal buffer and like basic, or terminal emulator and readline or other basic support in the background. It's not technically making an editor from scratch, so sorry, that's a disclaimer, I'm cheating. But only those mouse movements at most. Hopefully. If I corrupt my data, I'll use ed or an editor to fix it, but other than that, I'm at least counting scrolling and mouse copy paste to be not cheating right now, because I don't have a copy command in the editor. I'm going to have a go-to here, which that's heresy, right? That's heathenry. But I need a way to exit the switch and this overall loop, and I only know how to do that with go-to. Now C2Y actually has loop labels you can break from, so I could label like loop : and then do a break loop down here. If I had a label named loop, I could do break loop, I believe, in C2Y. Or with GNU extensions, you can probably do that for a while yet. And then I would have the label here, but I'm using C23 because it's not standardized yet. But anyway, that's a cool thing that will be added in like 10 years when people support that. So other than quitting, I need something to actually write the changes. So let's say write lines to file. And I'll have to reopen the thing here. So let's say we open our file name, our argv1 for writing. That will truncate it implicitly, so we'll overwrite the file. And for this, I'm going to say we're going to write it all the lines in the buffer by default. So I'm going to put a little to do here. We'll say use actual line range A1 to A2, not all lines in file or in buffer. But I will do that later. So line 1 to the last line inclusive, not A1 to A2, just for this first version at least, so that I know if I write the file, it'll actually write all the changes. But later on, we'll only want to write a subset of the lines so that we can write to another file, for example, or do other operations. For right now, we're going to write everything. And if we truncate the file, we can just write back to it with, say, fputS or fwrite, or however you want to do things. I'll do fputS for simplicity, and we'll just write lines offset by I out to the file pointer. And then we'll close when done. I should have a check for not fp here. I did not do that, but oh well. Let's assume the file opens if it was read initially and open for reading. I should have a check here though. Okay, we'll just write all that out, we'll break that, and that'll be the end of the switch, and this will be the end of the while loop up there. And then we'll have the done label that quit will go to, and I'll free all the memory. So let's free remaining line memory to be nice to the OS. Even though it's going to do this anyway, we'll be nice. We'll give him a little hat. He'll look like Frosty, the snowman. We'll just do that. So I'll do that equivalently with the last line and the first line inclusive here in the range. first line to the last line inclusive would be a better way to say that. And we'll free all of that. Okay, and then we'll be done. Hey, that's cool. Maybe you can have an exit or return 0 or whatever, but that should be all. That should be all we need to do to actually have a thing. Fingers crossed I didn't make mistakes. I always make mistakes. I put 2 M's there. Why did I do 2 M's? Okay. Maybe it was planned from the start so I can show off my sweet ed moves. No, I didn't actually plan to do that. Let's do plus 47 is how that works. We'll print that out. We have this. Let's substitute mem m move to mem move. That prints out the change by default, and we'll quit. Write the changes and quit. You didn't see that. Nobody saw that. I wasn't using ed to make an ed edit. That didn't make sense. That wasn't funny. So I added in those things. Let's see. Maybe I can make a change to the makefile. So one, I don't have a last line marker. That's not going to work. It says invalid. Addresses must be in ascending order. I should actually put continues in instead of printing both of these as well. So that's true. But let me make sure I can make changes here first. Printing the lines works. 1 to 8p, that also works. Can I add in delete? Let's say by default right now, after line 5, I have to enter in both lines to add right now. I'm going to add in a thing to say I'm going to copy my text because I am liable to mess up and corrupt it, and I don't want to retype everything out again. So let's just make a copy by default so that the source is there. Of course, every time I run make, it's going to do this, so I actually should add another target, but that's fine. We'll do that right now, end with a single period. Now we'll have 9 lines. We added that. I can write the changes. That gives invalid input because I need to actually put in stuff, even though we don't specify line ranges. If we just want to write everything, I do have to now from that scanf line. So, okay. That should have written everything, and I'll quit. And I'll just check that the makefile actually was written, and it was. If I run make, it'll copy it now, so I have a backup copy. Okay. So let's maybe add in that change. I had at least 50 lines. Let's add in a change for this stuff. Let's put in a continue after line 33 here. So let's say 33. We'll add in a change there. So that'd be 1 indent for the while, 1 for the if, 1 for right after the put s. Let's add in a continue and then stop. And then I want to add in one after here. Of course, I just added 1 line, so this will be line 39. The new line 39, 1, 2, 3. We'll do that. Just add in a new line. I'll do 1, 60. So now I have continues here. If we have a mistake, it'll go back and get a new line after printing only one of the errors. That would be good. And I can put in stuff like 0, 0, which is not valid, but it is right now. Because it looks interesting. 0, 0 looks like an owl, so I like doing that. But okay, made it. All right, cool. So now if I run this, say, on itself, and I copied it so it's not corrupted, I can do this, which doesn't exist. Yeah, I only get 1 error now. And if I put in 50, 20, they must be in ascending order. Okay. So we have adding lines. Do we have deleting lines? That's a good question. Let's add in, say, after line 4. We'll add in a couple lines of gibberish to then delete with the new fancy D command. And we'll add in line 3, and then we'll stop. So 5 to 8, I should have, 5 to 7. Okay, yeah, 5 through 7, we'll do delete. And then I have the things there without these lines. So those were deleted, and they were added in order. So it looks like delete and add were correct. I didn't need the extra +1 for the delete mem move, which is what I thought. I just didn't remember why, and that was why. So I don't override it. Cool. So adding and deleting, printing obviously works with a P or without a P. So I can grab it with indentation and copy and be lazy with the mouse. So that's the laziest I'll be till I add in a copy command. Quit works, write works. So I think we're good to go. That is my minimum viable editor, and I can use it to edit text, obviously including itself at a basic level. So from here, where do I want to go? For the next video, I want to actually not do a giant switch statement for everything. I think I'm just going to make an array of function pointers. So I'm going to add in functions for these commands, like a command append, command delete, stuff like that, depending how I name things. I'm going to add in functions for the commands, and then after those functions, I'm going to define an array of function pointers, and maybe they'll just return booleans or something so I can propagate error status up the stack. But I'll just have an array of command functions, and then instead of running a switch statement, I will use a designated initializer or otherwise define offsets within the array according to these characters, because this is just, a hex value, hex 41 or 61, I think, for lowercase at the end of the day. So at that offset within the array, we can have the function for the append command, and then instead of doing a switch on this, I can just dereference the command dereference the command function array offset by this character, and then call it as a function, and it'll run the command for this. So I'll do that on the next one, depending how long that takes. I have the p command, and I can just copy paste with the mouse, so it won't take that long. The indentation will be whack, but I can at least copy these or type them up again easily. After that, I want to add in functions to actually parse out the addresses and commands, and we'll try to add in, searching through the buffer with maybe / or question mark, and get in some basic regex stuff. Although regex.h isn't on Windows or other platforms. So I'll probably do some basic homemade regex, which will be really bad, but we'll go with that. Hopefully that sounds interesting, and this was somewhat enjoyable or entertaining. You can write a basic editor under 100 lines in a heredoc if you so choose, and if you enable GNU extensions or use a better language, you can do it in less still, but that's fine. But I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it, and cheers. Cerveza de mi padre. Es delicioso. Y muy bueno. But I'll see you later. I guess salud, sorry. Salud. Disculpe. And I'll see you then.